Thank you everyone for joining. We'll get started in just a moment or so. So this is the Engaged Community Series, episode number 4, Intersecting Identities, Confronting Hate Against Queer South Asians. And so this is being recorded, and once we finalize and clean up the recording, we will make it available on SAAPRI and SAAJCO platforms. And if you registered via Zoom or Eventbrite, you will get a link to the recording as well. And we do have a question and answer function available, and all of the responses are going to be anonymized, so you don't need to worry about being identified by name with any questions you may have. And at the end of our time, we'll have a few minutes for a handful of questions. Okay, and so we'll get started. So welcome and thank you for joining the 4th installment of the Engaged Community Series. It's collaboration between SAAPRI, the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, and SAAJCO, the South Asian American Justice Collaborative. My name is Jordan Stalker, and I have the pleasure of serving as today's panel moderator. I'm a scholar and teacher of intercultural communication and media representations, mostly at DePaul University in Chicago. And my teaching and writing is about who belongs and who says so. It's rooted in dialogue, allyship, and advocacy with marginalized communities. And I'm also the policy and research advisor for SAAPRI. And so if you haven't yet heard about either SAAPRI or SAAJCO, SAAPRI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, community-based organization that produces data-driven and community-centered knowledge to empower South Asian communities and individuals. And SAAJCO is a civil rights and legal services nonprofit committed to the advancement of civil and human rights of the South Asian diaspora in the United States through direct legal services, community engagement, and impact litigation. And we'd also like to thank the Saba Foundation and in Diaspora for their generous support of this series. And so the Engaged Community Series creates space for South Asians and allies to access knowledge, exchange ideas, and connect with resources that support justice and equity. Each month, we'll explore one of 3 interrelated themes of know your rights, unpacking hate, and civic participation in democracy through conversations with experts, advocates, and community leaders. And I'll remind everybody that today's session is being recorded, and afterward, they'll be available on SAAPRI and SAAJCO's platforms. And please feel free to use the question and answer function in Zoom for any questions you may have, and we'll do our best to get to those toward the end of tonight's conversation. And we'll also have other resources available to everyone at the end of today's session. And our goal is to make this conversation accessible to everyone while being specific about certain stories and realities and events. And so we're going to have a very exciting, energetic conversation. And so the panel is about a conversation about discrimination and violence faced by members of the queer South Asian diaspora. And so the panel, Intersecting Identities, Confronting Hate Against Queer South Asians, means that we are not separate, and that even though we may identify in one way or not another, there's no meaningful separation in our experiences or the support, allyship, and advocacy that we can and should and may be able to feel and embody. And we'll also hear about stories and solutions in the struggle for the right to belong and to thrive in the United States and within South Asian American communities. And beyond that, we want to use today to highlight the resilience, perseverance, and victories of the queer South Asian diaspora in the United States and paying tribute to the long-standing presence in the United States. And we also want to make clear that the experiences of the queer South Asian community is relevant to everybody, including those who may feel they're outside of that identity. We don't live in isolation from one another, no matter who we are or how we identify. And so our conversation is relevant to everyone. SAAPRI and SAAJCO and myself are proud to serve as allies and advocates, and I am deeply honored to serve as the facilitator. And so one effect of this is that queer people have existed as part of every community, whether it's ethnic, geographic, linguistic, racial, or otherwise. But despite this, queer people have faced discrimination, stigma, and outright violence within those larger communities. The South Asian community is no exception. And so one effect of this has been the further marginalization of queer people and the failure to recognize the community and to recognize that queer histories are not separate from other histories, including the broader history of what we call America. And that's the kind of frame that I want to set, for tonight's conversation. And so with that, I'll turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. And so I'd like to begin with Aruna Rao, the Executive Director of JC Rainbow.
Hi, such a pleasure to be here tonight. So yeah, my name is Aruna, my pronouns are she and her. As Jordan said, I'm the founder and the executive director of Desi Rainbow, which is a national organization that focuses on providing support, education, and advocacy for Desi LGBTQI folks and for their families. So I came to this work out of my own lived experience. I'm the parent of a queer and trans child, and that led me to my own journey of trying to figure out how to be an ally to my own child as well as to the LGBTQI community. And I'm now essentially doing my very best to essentially create an institutional support for LGBTQ folks, particularly LGBTQ children in our community. I also have a background in mental health advocacy. That's how I came to organizing. And essentially, I'm really honored to be in this position to provide a voice for families and for the diaspora.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kareem Kupchandani, and I don't know what my camera is doing. It's a new computer, sorry. My name is Kareem. I welcome any pronouns. I am an associate professor of theater, dance, and performance studies at Tufts University, which is in the Boston area. And I'm an author of several books dealing with queerness and South Asian questions, including Ishtyle, Accenting Gay Indian Nightlife, Decolonized Drag, and forthcoming is a book called Lessons in Drag. And I also perform primarily in queer South Asian spaces as Lahore Vajistan, every auntie's favorite auntie. Yeah, and I'll tell you more about myself and my work and things I know about as we go.
Great, thank you both so much. And I am excited to learn from your personal and professional experiences as we hold again this conversation and this genuine dialogue. And so I've got a couple of table setting questions. And Kareem, the first one is to you. So can you help us set the stage by telling us about the origins and the growth about the South Asian American queer community and the establishment of queer South Asian organizations, some struggles, stigmas, things that we should all be aware of?
Sure, yeah. So one thing to understand is that um, South Asian migrants to the U.S., to North America, to anywhere have always included queer folks, and this includes, we see examples of South Asian folks on indenture ships in the 19th uh, in the 19th century who are having sex with each other, and the reason we know about it is because they're being disciplined for it. We hear about Punjabi farmers in California in the early 20th century having same gender relations, and again, we hear about it because they were punished for it. But we've always been queer folks have always been here. Queer practices, queer sex has always been around. Um, but when it comes to organizing in particular, it's in the 1980s that we start to see folks in who are being radicalized by HIV/AIDS activism and ACT UP and organizations like that, really coming out into queer spaces and asking, where do we belong? So in California, we see two IIT grads from India, Arvind Kumar and Suvir Das, find each other through classified ads in Advocate magazine, both talking about, I'm South Asian, I'm gay, I'm lonely. Is there anyone else like me out there? And they get together to create an organization called Tricone Bay Area, that then inspires other Tricone organizations across the US to be formed. And with that, they created a magazine that they would send across the diaspora and even to South Asia. They would these like through discrete envelopes, making sure that queer content for people of all genders was available. Um, Around the same time in Chicago, Ifti Naseem, a migrant from Pakistan, and Viru Joshi from India, find each other through, again, a personal ad. And then they're like, well, there must be more folks like us. Let's put out a personal ad. And people start calling they just created a hotline themselves. And people would call into that line looking for support and would start coming to meetings at Ifti's house, and those meetings turned into dance parties and potlucks. Um, so the reason these organizations start appearing is because people are lonely and looking for support and friendship. People who speak a similar language, specifically immigrants, are looking for people who speak languages similar to them. Also, they're experiencing racism in LGBTQ spaces and are trying to find folks who might accept them for who they are. Um, a lot of these organizations were primarily gay men. And so other organizations blossomed made space uh, for women, for trans folks, others that focused more on religious identities. These organizations like Tricone, Kush, Salga, which you can find listed on Desi Rainbow Parents' website, have been social organizations that had food, drink, dance, music. Potlucks were so important to creating community, allowing people into your home and your home space, so they're not these kinds of depersonalized happening out in like institutional spaces. They've evolved into being organizations that do activism, advocacy, and care work. A lot of the organizations are premised on doing HIV education, having hotlines so that people can call in looking for care. Um, and then, I'll just mention there's one important moment that I think that was a moment of reckoning for a lot of organizations, which is in 1991, Salga, New York was created. And a couple of years later, once they were formalized, they tried to march in the India Day Parade in New York. And SALGA stands for South Asian Lesbian Gay Association. And when they wanted to march, they were told, well, you're South Asian, not Indian, so you can't march. But that became this way of not allowing queer people to march in the India Day Parade. And for many years, for over a decade, this battle kept happening of whether Salga could march or not. And some years they actually were able to, and some they were not. So even finding inclusion in sort of larger dominant spaces has always been a part of the battle for LGBT South Asian queer folks. Um, yeah, I'll pause there. I could go on for a good hour, so but I'll just pause there, and I'm sure more of this will come out as we go.
Sure. Thank you so much. And so next one is, to both of you, just because of your different trajectories of being with and in the queer community. So what are some challenges broadly that queer South Asians are facing navigating hate and oppression from society at large, internalized stigma, especially within their own families or larger cultural institutions? Kareem, you mentioned, already in one story, but perhaps something more interpersonal kinds of stigmas and issues and concerns. Maybe you could begin.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to start off by saying that we are currently, at this point, all queer and trans people in the United States are facing an unprecedented situation, essentially an attack on all sides. Trans people are facing legal and social erasure, and of course, denial of access to healthcare. Children particularly are at risk now of essentially both physical and emotional harm. So we're living in very, very difficult times for the queer and trans community at large, particularly for the immigrant, both the foreign-born and the first-generation, LGBTQI folks and their families. There are a whole host of issues, some of which, as you pointed out, Jordan, are linked to our own communities and our own cultural barriers towards accessing safety. And some of it essentially is being at this intersection, as Kareem pointed out, of facing both pushback and stigma and discrimination because of your LGBTQ identity, and also because of your racial and ethnic identity. So mainstream LGBTQ spaces are not necessarily friendly towards queer and trans immigrants. And so those are some of the kinds of things that people face. I'll just let you know a little bit of like what This Rainbow Century runs support, support groups, peer-to-peer support for LGBTQI folks and for their families. And what we mostly see and hear about a lot is the experience of coming out. The majority of our children, and for me they're all children, essentially delay coming out. They wait until they're emotionally and financially and physically safe. So typically you will find perhaps people in school and college being very, very careful about who knows about their identities. And the majority of LGBTQI Desi folks of school and college age are not out to their families. So that's a very, kind of important issue to address, because they don't feel safe in their families, they don't feel safe in their communities. So that's something that we need to, as a community, really address. Once they come out, there's a lot of barriers that are related to finding not just acceptance, but basic respect and dignity, both in family and community settings. So typically we hear a lot of people tell us about instances when they are essentially disrespected in family and community situations, because even though there may be a kind of grudging acceptance, yes, you're part of this, you're going to be part of our family or a community, there's not enough of safety. And I keep addressing that. It's the safety, both, that's a fundamental thing that everybody's looking for, to feel at home in this setting. And that's not available to them, definitely, in any kind of family community spaces. It's changing. Things have started changing, I think, especially in the last 10 years since I've been engaged in this work. Things were definitely progressing. But now, of course, we're looking at setbacks because of the political climate. So these are some of the things that I feel are kind of super important. I do want to kind of address the issue of especially with younger children. Families may feel that they're being supportive and really getting what they need for their child. But they don't understand essentially that their LGBTQ child can face racism and xenophobia in mainstream spaces. So for instance, I'm thinking of the example of a family that when their teen came out as gay, sent him to an LGBTQ summer camp, and the child came back really traumatized by feeling essentially completely out of place and not really seen or heard in that context. So I think it's really important to understand this intersection of where our kids are coming from.
Thank you, Aruna. That's really comprehensive and helpful. My research has mostly been with migrants and folks who moved to the US, and I think there's some very specific things that affect folks, just from your accent to how you love and desire, what taste you have. You're often told you're not, migrant folks are often told you're not doing queerness properly, right? You don't have the correct body, or you're too hairy, or you eat a certain way, you don't go to the gym, right? People are hearing these actual things when they try to date, when they use dating apps. You don't have the right music taste, etc. So people become quite self-conscious about, am I, so sometimes it doesn't feel like racism, but it's these critiques of one's lifestyle that make by other queer people that make you quite self-conscious about whether you belong in queer spaces at all. Um, I, I think the xenophobia and racism can be quite explicit. I was called a terrorist in a gay club in DC. You know, I think a lot of queer South Asian folks experience racism on dating apps in particular, where people can use the shield of anonymity and in order to say what they feel like. Um, I think also uh, this is the extreme case of how migrants are affected by this kind of alienation and isolation. But in Toronto, between 2010 and 2017, there was a serial killer who was targeting South Asian and Middle Eastern gay men. And specifically because he understood that they did not have familial connections in the country, right? So, quote unquote, no one would miss them. Right. And so the ways that in which we are seen as being these kind of isolated migrant figures, sort of lost in in the world, makes us vulnerable to many kinds of violences, including including death, including severe loneliness, including blackmail. I have an interlocutor who I spoke to when I was doing my research, who said that his employer wouldn't renew his visa, or was holding over the fact that he was gay, um, in order, and said, I'll tell your family you're gay, and I won't renew your visa." Right? He's got these two things to hold over this person to keep him in employment. And so I think queer South Asian migrants in particular are facing these various forms of control, alienation, and again with the current state of immigration politics, we can see how that might um, heighten how people are experiencing this current moment.
Thank you. Do you feel that, or in your own work and conversations, the last 6 months in particular, when it comes to immigrant anxieties, has there been, a marked difference than it was, even before this new administration came in? And what are some things that you've heard, people are most concerned about that maybe they weren't concerned as much about before?
I don't know if that's intended for me or Kareem, but I'm glad to do that. So definitely, I mean, in my my experience as an immigrant, this is the very worst time for LGBTQ folks who are immigrants and asylees in this country. The largest portion of LGBTQ folks here are either immigrants or asylees. So they're dealing with unprecedented levels of fear and anxiety. Basically, definitely the immigration process is one of the biggest issues because many people are on visas. Their immigration process is kind of, winding its way through the system. So they're extraordinarily afraid of this being derailed, something that they have worked so hard for so many years. So just basic freedoms, speaking out, being visible, all of these are dangerous at this time. And so I think that's something that we really, really need to consider. Of course, there's a situation now with trans people essentially who are applying for visas or for entry to the US, not essentially even being considered to gain access to the US unless they agree to misgender themselves. So, they're essentially required to use their sex assigned at birth in all documentation. So I was at World Pride last week, the Human Rights Conference, and there was so few trans people from outside the country who even wanted to visit or could visit because of this issue. So I think there's a huge amount of fear right now.
And as we think about detention and detainment, we have to acknowledge that there are South Asian undocumented folks, and there are queer South Asian undocumented folks. And I think our tendency is to sort of imagine the crises outside of our worlds, but they're actually quite close to us. Um, during my field work, encountered two folks who were in a relationship in India and made it into the US, crossed borders through all kinds of ways to get here, and then were held at the US Mexico border. And in detention is where they encountered some of the most severe homophobia, right? And so they had to come up with a story that they were brothers, um, in order to survive detention. And and trans folks as well are not being held, are being misgendered inside of detention centers as well. So as we see these like immigration crackdowns, the ways that they impact queer people is can actually be really severe and worrying. Um, I also, I don't know, you mentioned asylum as well, that people coming to the queer and trans people coming to the US for asylum are often trying to escape the wreckage of American empire, right? They're not simply just coming to the US because it's better here, but it's because America made it so bad to be where they are that they look to this as a place to come. But asylum alone is such a vexed process where you have to denounce all the queer possibilities that might have been around you, where you're from, and you have to play this kind of wounded subject for this nation to adopt you. So that it's not a sexy kumbaya process of like finding a new home, but it's this real kind of identity negotiation, in order to make it here as well.
Thank you so much, Cole. And thinking about the idea of possibilities of making it and institutions and social supports. And so, Aruna, maybe can you talk a little bit about how can South Asian American and allied community organizations that are not necessarily focused at this time on supporting queer youth or queer communities, how can they better include those voices in their mission statements, in their work? Or even if you'd like to, take a few minutes to talk about what is it that Daisy Rainbow does that other organizations that support queer youth do not do.
Yeah, no, I think what SAAPRI and SAAJCO are doing today, for instance, is a definite, a great step here. Finding opportunities not just during Pride Month to highlight queer and trans issues, to bring in queer and trans voices. I think that's super important at this time because the queer and trans community is under siege. You may not always find people who are able to speak up, but just even addressing the issue, acknowledging the existence of the queer and trans community in the missions that many of these organizations are engaged in, I think is really important. What Desi Rainbow does is essentially our mission essentially is to affirm and celebrate the existence of the diversity of gender diverse folks, sexually diverse folks, because I think too often the conversations are about acceptance. It's not just about saying yes, you exist, as much as elevating these voices and also like celebrating their existence. I mean, I really feel that queer and trans people bring so much into these spaces that you don't think about unless you're actually hearing these voices. So I think in that context, many of the organizations that are well-intentioned are perhaps not really like doing the very basic work of just making sure that it's mentioned. A lot of organizations are doing great work with mental health advocacy. LGBTQ folks are at much larger risk of mental health issues due to all the stigma and discrimination that they encounter in society. So why aren't mental health organizations also centering these kinds of situations and working more to work with these communities? We have a huge number of organizations that deal with gender justice in this country, South Asian organizations. I mean, I think those were some of the oldest organizations that were founded because there was the issue of domestic violence and trying to figure out how to support, particularly, I think, cis women who were dealing with these situations with violence, intimate partner violence, violence at home. And I think it's super important for these organizations to step into a space where they acknowledge that LGBTQ folks need similar support. So those are some of the ways where, organizations that already have a certain mission can find opportunities to work with the LGBTQ community. And I think most importantly, not just confining it to one thing. It can't be just Pride Month. This has to be incorporated into your work to essentially welcome LGBTQ issues and themes and topics and people into the work that you're engaged in.
Great, thank you so much. And so we've kind of set the stage as the reality, where we've been, where we are on the individual and personal level, and now the institutional level. But one of the things that we also wanted to use this time for is talk about possibilities of joy. And so, Kareem, I want to kind of talk to you about how performance and entertainment about these issues and ways of thinking about these issues can open up pathways for dialogue, understanding, and ultimately joy in these spaces and for these conversations. So where we can go next. And so talking about your academic work that seems to me to be interlocked joyfully, I'm sure, with your life as a drag performer as well. And have you thought about what is it about drag culture in particular as an art form that might be helpful in telling the stories of queer South Asians or South Asians in general as sites of joy, resistance, and healing?
Yeah, so I started performing in drag in 2009 in Chicago at a fundraiser, and it was a one-time thing, and that was supposed to be it. And it was so much fun, right? It was, uh, we were trying to raise funds for Trico in Chicago to participate in the Pride Parade. It's really expensive, just so you know. Um, but and I've seen the video. I wasn't particularly good, but I think that sense of community and joy and pleasure really does galvanize people to say, "Oh, I want to be here and I want to come back." So, as I think about drag and as I write about drag, one of the things I think about is how, as we come out, we often have to give up some of our culture, right? Some of what we grew up with, because we're not invited to this cousin's wedding anymore. We're not invited back to the masjid or the temple or the gurdwara that we used to go to. And so we coming out often means leaving behind certain pieces of our body, our repertoire, our history, our language. And so drag to me is this opportunity to seize it back again. Many of us come from cultures who dance and sing constantly. And then you're not invited to those dancing and singing and chanting and whatever it is, spaces. Drag allows us to put some of that back on our body. And it allows us to do it in a place that is, we can do it. We can do it in our bedroom. We can do it in private, but drag brings it out into the public as a site of affirmation to say, yes, work, girl, you did it, and like that to me is really important. So that fundraiser in Chicago then became a party that has now been running for 15 years, called Jeho. And then I also run an annual event in New York called Dragistan. That is the largest convening of South Asian drag, bringing in performers from across the coasts to see what each other does as well. When I started performing, there were very few like folks with public drag personas, and now like they're like too many for me to count, and they're so good and they're so fun and they're so joyful. So I encourage you to look up Desi drag artists and follow their social media, tell them how gorgeous and beautiful and amazing they are. They come in all kinds of genders, and are from all our different diasporas, descendants of indenture, folks from Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and India and Pakistan and multiple other diasporas. So yeah, I do think that uh, and the last thing I'll say is also drag is really appealing because our straight audiences get it, right? Straight Desi audiences are like, oh, I do understand music and dance. Maybe I don't understand identity, but I do see that we have this language, rhythm, dress in common, and it allows for relation, so it's not necessarily about connecting through stories of woundedness and loss and hurt, but it is this way of connecting through shared pleasures.
Thank you. And that's an excellent segue to the follow-up question that broadens us out a little bit. Because you talked specifically about the South Asian drag culture that you're a part of. And I'm just wondering, what should we keep in mind when it comes to the kinds of commitments that you've experienced that South Asian or Desi queerness has that might be different from the commitments that other queer communities might have, and how have those interlocked? Have they come into conflict? Would have been some positive resolutions? Or are those communities still relatively isolated?
Um, well, I mean, I think there's so as I put together this show every year, I'm like, okay, how do I make sure that there are folks that trans folks are well represented, that folks from multiple diasporas are represented, and it doing this work makes me very aware of the kinds of stories, South Asian stories we lift up and which ones we don't, right? And so we're usually first to lift up gay Indian men. Um, and we often leave others out of, or there's something implicit. So I think there's actually a lot of work we as South Asians have to do internally. Um, this is a unique experience to us to navigate the kind of diversity inside of our community and to acknowledge our privileges and in the work that we do. So we have to talk about caste, right? Caste is something that a lot of other other racialized communities don't have to engage with, right? They have their other internalized conversations to have, but we have to talk about caste and who gets to make it to the US, right? Who already has the caste privilege to make it to the US in order to participate in these like fabulous, fun, queer communities that we've built for each other. Um, I, uh, I think that we have to admit that with specificity, Indian Americans are one of the wealthiest communities, minority communities in the U.S. And so, what what kinds of privileges do we have, and how do we use those privileges to include or exclude? So I'm thinking of a moment in which I was throwing a party. And a friend had it was a South Asian queer pride party, and a friend had brought his Latino friend with him, or a few Latino friends with him, and they were speaking Spanish together, and an Indian man turns to him and says, "We're in America, speak English," right? So our investment in the sort of model minority paths that we think we are laid out ahead of us often we use to create rifts between communities that we could have other relationships and commitments to. So even as we talk about the hate that queer South Asians experience, I think we also have to think about how we to inflict that, right? And how we hold each other accountable to our caste privileges, to our wealth privilege, and things like that, that are, I think, quite specific to South Asian communities.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So there's a couple of more questions I've got, but also there's several good ones in Q&A. So perhaps I should jump to one of the Q&A session questions. can you talk a little bit about the idea of resilience in your own coming out story, or how could you encourage someone who is struggling themselves with coming out in public, intimate, private spaces? You know, both of you are well equipped to answer this question. How would you encourage somebody who's struggling with this?
Yeah, so coming out is such a convoluted topic, right? So there's also a narrative that you have to come out, which is not necessarily the case. There are people, and I think like so many of us who are immigrants or queer and trans people are used to having certain parts of ourselves that we share with others and certain parts that we only share with some people. And so I think coming out is not necessarily a linear process. You don't have to if you don't want to, because that's something that is, your desire to do this. That said, for particularly for younger folks who are looking for community, looking for support, looking for some kind of space where they can be themselves. Coming out is something, especially coming out to their families, can make a huge difference in their lives. There's a lot of research which essentially shows that children who have supportive families, queer and trans children who have supportive families, um, have a huge reduction in the mental health issues that they face. So rates of depression, rates of suicidality, all of these things decrease with family and community support. So this coming out process has to be something where they face not essentially, a lot of times, even with the best of intentions, parents and community members can think of this as, you've revealed something that is like an illness. It's something wrong with you that you've revealed, and so now we have to deal with it. It's a problem to be dealt with. So I think it's really important to understand that someone coming out to you, whether it's a child or an adult, is sharing something that is really important to them and something that they really value about themselves. So to treat it as a joyful, thing is I think is really important. And that said, I did not handle my child's coming out very well because I was full of fear and anxiety. So I think that's one of my big messages to folks in the community, particularly parents and elders. Don't see this as a problem to be solved. This is something that is a celebratory act for whoever is coming out to you. So that's pretty much what I would want to say about coming out. I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, just how would you encourage someone?
Yeah. I mean, Aruna, I think you're really right to say like uh, coming out is an option, but it's not the only one, right? You you don't have to come out, right? Um, you can be queer without having to sort of do that performance of it. And if people find out, then you navigate it then. But I think that we place so much ceremony around this like act of saying I am X. And sometimes you don't know what you are. I definitely think that I came out to my family before I was ready to come out to them, but because I felt the pressure to, right? I felt guilty that I wasn't being honest with them, but then they didn't know what to do with that information, and I didn't know what to do with that information, right? So one of the things I would say is, um, come out, there are some lower stakes places in which you can come out in an anonymous poetry blog. um I had been in the US for 1 week, and I walked up to some strangers in Central Park and tapped them on the shoulder and said, "Hi, are you gay? I think I'm gay," right? And truly, these men were angels, and they like gave me a bunch of resources. But I mean, it was high stakes, but it was lower stakes in that I didn't know them, and it wasn't my family, right? So there are other ways. There are sort of other ways to buffer that. If you want to say it out loud, you can say it in other places and spaces before you bring it to the people who are perhaps most close to you, or you worry the most about losing. One of the things I did was come out to my cousin before I came out to my parents, so that I was like, if they kick me out, can I come and sleep at your place? Right. Um, so just like even knowing and buffering and gauging those, safety is a real question. So I'm not trying to mitigate it, but but you can plan, right? You can plan about how you want to navigate that process.
Thank you so much. So I've got one question that looks at the position of South Asian Americans in the diaspora, those who might have caste privilege when it comes to supporting those back home in, countries that have even stricter restrictions, even more dire consequences for either coming out or just being in the world. And so do either of you have any thoughts about, the commitments that, the diaspora has, to, you know, South Asia? How can we navigate that and ally and support and advocate?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily very aware of things beyond what's happening in India. But I did want to say that even in India, I found thriving queer communities. There are essentially like, people have built like, structures and supports for themselves that really like allow so much joy in the process of being queer, even in a country where institutions perhaps are stacked against you. So I think that's really important to address. And I think that for those in the diaspora who want to support, fund them, fund these organizations, fund these people, because that's really like the best way for you to offer some kind of support. Of course, if you can get personally involved, there are like plenty of organizations that do like some great work, particularly with trans communities in India. So I would say essentially like what we have is the privilege perhaps of like being able to like send some funding to these organizations. And I think we have a lot to learn from queer and trans folks in out there in different parts of the world who have a lot of resilience and who have learned a lot of things about how to navigate a hostile world.
So one of the things that like when I first started doing my research and started doing interviews, I was focused on the diaspora, and I was asking folks, about their experiences with queer South Asian activism and organizations and events. And someone said to me, it's so nice that we have this here because back home there's none of that. And it was actually that comment that made me like raise funds to go back to go to India and see what was there. And what I found was a thriving world of activism, performance, nightlife, uh, um, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, and we see similar things. Nepal has an older queer activism scene than India does. We see fantastic trans organizing in Pakistan, where trans folks are involved in citywide and regional politics. I just was talking to one of my graduate students today who was working with trans women in rural Jaffna in Sri Lanka, and talking about the amazing organizing and performing that they're doing. And so, I think that as we think about how do we help, I think we have to make relationships like individual grassroots relationships with folks in the subcontinent. And when they ask for help, we support, right? When they're like, hey, Bill Gates pulled out his funding from India and this project we used to do is no longer supported. We could really use that. That's when we show up, right? That's when we gather our dollars and we send them. Um, but I think that rather than creating the dichotomy that we're able to do it here, they can't do it there. I think creating symbiotic relationships in which we learn from those organizers and artists there, and also listen to their calls for what they need and support them is what I think is most important.
Great, thank you. And so I put up here a slide that we put together of some resources, using History Rainbow's guide, and then SAAPRI also has one. So this will be available to everyone through SAAPRI's website about getting involved and who to support and what kinds of actions that we as individuals can take to support these larger organizations, large and small organizations, I should say. So we're kind of coming up close to the end of time, and we've got a couple of things to mention, but maybe as a way to bring us to a close, focusing on these ideas of joy and aspiration and inspiration, are there moments or individuals within queer South Asian American history who, Kareem and Aruna, you feel that all of us on this call and everyone should be aware of and know about, and you can kind of promote them for us?
I think Kareem, I'm sorry, go ahead, Kareem.
So Jordan has the links to two folks that I think are so fantastic and important. One is Ifti Naseem, who I mentioned earlier, who started an organization called Sangat in Chicago in the mid 80s. And I did an interview with him that is now on the South Asian American Digital Archives. And then there's an article about Ifti in the Juggernaut. And Ifti was an activist, a poet who performed in three who wrote and performed in three different languages, and also like a Mercedes-Benz salesman who and very proud of his career. Came to the U.S. as to go to law school, and then ran away from Michigan to Chicago to live his fabulous gay life. And brought his entire family to the US, and then did a bunch of post 9/11 activism advocating for Muslims and South Asians, bringing together interfaith communities. So just someone I admire very much, really impacted everything I think about when I think about being queer and brown in the US. The other link is to a book called The Truth About Me by A. Revati, who's a Hijra activist in Tamil Nadu, and she's also a performer and playwright and activist and educator. And I think it's really important to lift her work as well. I just am so in awe of the work she's done, both at the NGO kind of institutional level and at the social, taking care of other folks, writing her own story as well. And her book is great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've actually met Revati. She's amazing. I've seen her perform, and can definitely second that. I just wanted to throw out two things. One was, I think if you don't already follow them, Alok Vaid Menon is a poet, a performer, influencer, somebody who has really been instrumental for this current generation of LGBTQ folks, South Asians in this country, and for many other LGBTQ children, to really like consider what it might be like to live your life exactly how you want to. So I strongly recommend, they've written books, they perform, they're everywhere on media. The other thing I would say is that one of the things that I confronted is that my child is the first out LGBTQ person that I knew, right? That I had a close relationship with. So what I would suggest is that look at your own families, your own family histories, and consider how many people there are in your lineage who could have been queer or trans. Not everybody was out, right, as a queer and trans person. So our children didn't spring out of nowhere. There is like all of our families have like these histories. So I would strongly encourage you to like actually explore your own family histories and think of this as like, essentially tracing your own queer and trans lineage in your families.
thank you all so much, for your time, your energy, and thank you everyone who attended for your participation in tonight's conversation. And we hope, and I know that it was insightful, engaging, and joyful, even though we talked about, things about trauma and survival and violence, punishment, but all of those leading up to these moments of joy that we can have, and we can highlight, and we can emphasize and advocate for even more and more. And so I just wanted to kind of share some things about upcoming events. In the 5th edition of the ECS series is coming up on July 10th. Again, 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central. And this is going to be about workplace discrimination and legal protections in a changing landscape. And the registration link is in the chat. And we're also conducting research about the immigrant experience post January 2025. And there's a survey you can take and share there as well. So again, thank you all, Kareem, Aruna, for your efforts, your work, your attention, your energy. And we'll share this recording when it's available, and many more resources on the SAAJCO and SAAPRI websites. So thank you all so much for your time, and looking forward to seeing you at our upcoming panels. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.